G'day and welcome to today's episode of Territory Famous with your host, Kelly Arrowsmith. Just a word of warning, it is going to be a huge one. I have 21 pages of notes. So this could be a two-parter. We'll see how we go. But I can't have a podcast called Territory Famous and not cover Rod Ansell. If you don't know who Rod is, he was the inspiration for Crocodile Dundee. Now, you may have heard another bloke, Crocodile Harry of Coober Pedy fame, was the man behind Mick Dundee, and while Crocodile Harry is quite the character, once you hear Rod's story, it's hard to deny that he was the real life Mick Dundee. I will do an episode on Harry one day because, fun fact, he also hunted crocs in the Territory. But if you want to hear a bit about him now, I'll link a podcast episode on Coober Pedy that I did in the show notes. And that was on my other podcast, Kel's Gone Bush, which is all Australian stories, pretty much like this one, but covers all of Australia instead of just the Northern Territory. So you would think having a movie written about your life, especially one as wildly successful as Crocodile Dundee, would set you up for life. But unfortunately for Rod, that's not what happened. Rod didn't get his happy ending. Instead, his story spiraled into a tragic series of events that culminated in the deaths of two men, one who died a hero and the other one who died a criminal. It's a long story, so get comfy, grab a coffee or a beer, or if you like me, a large glass of red, and let's get into it. Rod was born in Murgon, Queensland, which is around 245 kilometres northwest of Brisbane, to parents George William Ansell and Eva May Ansell in 1954. He was the third of four children. In his own words, he was a shocking student and more interested in filling the garage with shoeboxes of silkworms and the backyard with his 14 pet wallabies than he was in grammar. At the age of 15, he moved to the Northern Territory, which would have been a dream for a kid like him. At 17, he left home and learned to toss cattle, which involves wrapping the animal's tail around your hand and fainting one way or another until, weighing close to a ton and very angry, the animal trips over itself and falls. I got that particular bit of info from a lady called Margot, who wrote an article about Rod after meeting him years ago. If you Google tossing cattle or cattle toss, nothing really comes up. Not sure why. If any cattle farmers want to weigh in on that and how legal it is these days, I'd love to hear from you. My research did, however, uncover the art of cow tipping, which is where people sneak up on cows while they're asleep and tip them over, which is weird. But anyway, fun fact. So Rod led a fairly uneventful life, well, about as uneventful as it could be when you're tossing cattle. But in May 1977, that all changed. Shortly after finishing a buffalo catching job in Kununurra, Western Australia, Rod decided to take what he called a fishing trip to Victoria River. Now, calling it a fishing trip might have been a stretch, since Rod isn't exactly known for sticking to a detailed itinerary. He casually told his then-girlfriend Lorraine that he would be back in a few months, and off he went. Things took a dramatic turn when Rod's motorboat was capsized and sunk by something big. He later claimed it was a whale, which raises the question, what kind of fishing was Rod planning exactly? Stranded almost 200 kilometres from the nearest human settlement, Rod managed to climb aboard his tender, a small dinghy with one oar, and retrieve his two 8-week-old bull terriers and a modest bit of gear, a rifle, a knife, some canned food, and an old swag. Oh, and one of the dogs had broken his leg just to keep things interesting. During the night, his dinghy drifted out to sea, eventually washing up on a small island near the Fitzmaurice River. And that's when shit got real. Severely dehydrated, Rod managed to follow the river's tidal flows, and after a couple of days, he found fresh water. Dehydrated and low in salt, Rod shot cattle and drank the blood before curing the meat. He captured bees that were drinking his dog's water and followed them back to the hive by tying bits of cotton from his shirt to their legs and following them as they flew back to the hive. At night, he had to sleep in a tree fork to avoid crocodiles, although he had to share the space with a brown tree snake. Depending on which version you read, I've also read that there was a venomous brown snake, which is not the same as a brown tree snake. One will probably kill you, the other slightly venomous. I reckon it would have been a brown tree snake because that makes the most sense, but the story is more impressive if you add in a deadly brown snake. Not that this story needs any more embellishing. At one point, he shot a 5-metre crocodile and kept its head as a souvenir. I guess when you've spent 50-something days sleeping in a tree and drinking buffalo blood, you deserve something for your trouble. Despite all this, Rod never expected to be rescued. He figured everyone would be looking for him at the Victoria River, not the Fitzmaurice, and he planned to trek overland to a pastoral station once the wet season began. Luckily, his plans changed when he heard horse bells and stumbled upon 2 Aboriginal stockmen and their cattle manager, Luke McCall. Emaciated but otherwise fine, Rod made it back home and decided not to tell anyone about the ordeal. He thought his mum would crack the shits. But somehow the newspapers got hold of the story and Rod's private adventure turned into a public sensation. By August 1977, he was being called a modern-day Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe, for anyone like me that didn't know, is a fictional character that was cast away on desert islands for 28 years, and the book was written in 1719, which is probably why I've never heard of it. Anyway, Rod himself downplayed the experience, saying all the blokes up in this country who work with cattle, ringers, stockmen, bull catchers, whatever, all of them have really narrow shaves all the time, but they never talk about it. I think the opinion is if you come through in one piece and you're still alive, then nothing else really matters. It's like going out to shoot a kangaroo. You don't come back and say you missed by half an inch. You either got him or you didn't. So that's how I looked at it. Until the paper got hold of the story, and that changed a lot of things. So when Rod's survival story got out, he became the centre of media attention. He co-wrote a book, To Fight the Wild, with author Rachel Percy, and was featured in a documentary of the same name. He got flown to Sydney to be interviewed by journalist Michael Parkinson, and when he tried to get on the plane barefoot, the steward wasn't having it. He made him put on, I'm guessing, those slippers they give you when you're on the plane, and Rod said to him, my feet are probably cleaner than your shoes because I watch where I step. They then put him up in some fancy hotel in Sydney, but Rod refused to sleep in the bed, choosing his old swag instead. And when he saw a bidet in the bathroom, he had no fucking idea what it was. Does any of this sound familiar? Yep, a few years after Rod's ordeal, a bloke called Paul Hogan came up with, and yes, I'm doing air quotes, the idea for a fish out of water story about a tough Aussie bushie meeting a pretty American writer and heading off to New York. Hogan reckoned he got the idea on a trip to New York, but Hogs has been known to be somewhat of a bullshit artist. The movie even had Mick Dundee poaching crocs when he was lost in the bush, exactly what most Territory locals thought that Rod was doing when he went missing. And let's not forget, Mick was an initiated white fella, which Rod actually was. But for a while, Rod didn't even know the movie was out. After his ordeal out bush, he met a young radio operator named Joanne. They got married and had 2 sons, Callum and Sean, and in 1985, Rod borrowed some money and secured a pastoral lease in northern Arnhem Land. He set up Melaleuca, a cattle station about 140 kilometres east of Darwin near Kakadu National Park. By the time Crocodile Dundee came out, the family was living out there. They mostly communicated by radio because the nearest phone was 10 kilometres away outside a slaughterhouse. Eventually, Rod got wind of the movie and went to watch it with his family. He thought it was a great film, but reckoned it was obvious where Hogs got his material from. It could be argued that what happened next kicked off a chain of events that would eventually lead to tragedy. So, to start with, Rod's cattle station was going to shit. In the 1980s, the government rolled out the bovine brucellosis and tuberculosis eradication campaign, otherwise known as the BTEC, which meant he had to kill 3,000 feral buffalo on his property. Rod had planned to domesticate them and build a herd, which would have given his family a comfortable life, but instead he had to destroy the lot and he wasn't happy about it. He reckoned the money would have been better spent on research for AIDS. To top it off, 3 of his neighbours got $100,000 in government loans to help out, but Rod got absolutely jack shit. There's speculation it was because his cattle were feral, while the others had domesticated herds, but who knows the real story. Then in 1986, Rod picked up a hitchhiker called Dominic McCann, an adventure tour planner from California. The 2 of them came up with the idea to turn Melaleuca into a tourist spot using Rod's survival story as the big draw card. Now, Rod even called Hogan's office in Sydney to see if he could bill himself as the real Crocodile Dundee in his brochures. What he got back was a letter from Hogan's partner, John Coronial. The letter This is how it went. Sorry, mate, but you cannot use Crocodile Dundee in any advertising either in Australia or the USA. Lawyers from Paramount and Rimfire Films, which was Hogan's company, would descend on you from a great height. Rod was not impressed with that response. He said, I really can't understand their position. I explained very carefully that I was willing to sign a piece of paper saying I had no rights to royalties. What I really want the right to say is what they've already said, that Hogs got the idea from myself. It could really help my little thing here. Now, there's so many different versions of this story and how Paul Hogan actually came up with the idea, including Paul Hogan's ridiculous claim that he got it from a trip to New York, which is like clearly it's Rod's story. In Crocodile Dundee, when he goes to New York, he rolls out his swag on the floor and he doesn't know what the bidet is. And that was off Rod's own words in his own interview. So I don't know why Paul Hogan thinks we're all stupid, but that's a podcast for another day. Anyway, what did happen was, in an early radio interview, Rod claimed Hogan had once admitted the Parkinson interview was what sparked the whole Dundee idea. Now, there's no transcript of that radio show, but back in 1986, Ken Shady, one of Hogan's scriptwriting team, told a reporter that after seeing Rod on TV, Hogan thought this is an ideal character for himself. Of course, no one was going to admit this. Shady later said, all I can say is the story came from Paul Hogan, and Cornell's camp stuck to the line that the idea for Dundee came from Paul Hogan's head. Rod was pretty disappointed but decided to press on anyway. McCann, not 100% sure how to pronounce his name, wrote the brochure for him, calling Rod the Bushman superstar who inspired Crocodile Dundee. When someone asked him what he'd do if Paramount sued him, Rod admitted they'd probably win. But his wife Joanne didn't seem too worried. She said, I think Hogan's been really bad-mannered. Let him try whatever he likes. We'll stand up and knock him back down again. As it turned out, Hogan never did sue him, but things still went downhill. The BTEC campaign had already hammered them financially, and then Rod had a massive mimosa weed problem that rendered most of his land useless. By 1991, they were forced to sell Melaleuca, and their marriage broke down. The boys, Callum and Sean, went to live with Joanne. I actually think this was a massive blow to Rod. I think that losing his wife and children really, really affected him mentally and had a huge impact on his life, and things just rapidly got worse from there. In 1992, Rod was convicted of stealing 30 cattle worth $7,200 and was fined $520 for assaulting a station manager. Around that time, he'd also taken up growing and selling weed and smoking a shitload of it, according to his mates. But the weed wasn't the only thing. Rod had developed a serious amphetamine habit. Then, in 1993, Rod met Sherry Huitson, and that was a perfect storm because Sherry had her own set of problems. She had gone up to the NT to work as a tour guide, and she saw an ad Rod had placed in a Shady Camp boat hire to help him break in horses. She went out to his camp and never left. She also shared his love of amphetamines, and the two of them shacked up together at Yurapunga Station, an Aboriginal community. According to Sherry, the first couple of years of their relationship was pretty good, and Rod, even with a raging speed habit, was fairly stable, and she called him brilliant and a genius. However, in the last year of their relationship, Rod had gone downhill. She said he was using more often and had become unpredictable and paranoid. In one statement to police later on, she admitted they would stay up for 3 days at a time on their drug binges. Though Sherry herself may have been contributing to Rod's paranoia. Sherry was then 28 years old and later told police she was born and raised in Victoria and studied a Bachelor of Applied Science and Physical Education at what she called the Victoria University in Footscray, down in Melbourne. Now, I'm not sure why it was written in the police report that way because there actually is a Victoria University in Footscray, but this was before Google, so I'm guessing they just had no idea. Anyway, it was just weird. I just thought I'd add that in. So, Sherry herself was a bit messed up. Friends later told police that Rod had told them she was depressed and suicidal. Whatever the case, she was telling Rod some pretty wild stories about them coming from a family of Freemasons, about Sherry coming from a family of Freemasons. The Freemasons, that's something that I am going to leave a link in the show notes of research you can have a look on Google, because to try and explain the Freemasons is a whole podcast episode. Basically, to me, it seems like this big giant cult all over the world. There's all these chapters of Freemasons, and depending on what articles you read or what website you go on, there's a lot of different explanations of what they're about, what they do, and how you can be one, and whether women can be one, and all of that stuff. So I'm not going to get into that, but basically the best way I can describe it is it's like a giant cult. Well, what Sherry's referring to sounds like a giant cult. Anyway, because she told police that she was scared that they were after her because she had left them. She also told police they sacrificed children and drank their blood, and she had done this herself. Now, just keep in mind, Sherry is on a fucking boatload of drugs at this point. And also, imagine her telling that to Rod after they've had a 3-day drug bender. It got pretty wild. The pair of them became more and more paranoid and moved from Europunga to a bush camp they made out of trucking tarp. They sank into delusions that the Freemasons were up there in the bush looking for them, and that Rod's boys were in danger. Sherry claimed she saw them one night near their camp, but it actually turned out to be a group of hunters wearing night vision goggles, and it had nothing to do with Sherry at all. By now, Rod was well and truly sucked into this story about the Freemasons and had it in his head that they were after himself, Sherry, and Rod's 2 sons, Callum and Sean. And it's possible that him and Sherry were caught in a shared delusional system, which later experts would speculate they were in what's called a folie à deux, which is French for madness of two, and also called a shared psychosis or shared delusional disorder, a rare psychotic syndrome in which symptoms of a delusional belief are transmitted from one individual to another. To be honest, it's hard to say if it was this disorder or the fact they were both on a shitload of amphetamines, or both. But whatever the case, they were delusional, and at this point they were becoming dangerous. Sherry mentions later in her police interview that Rod assisted her in processing her flashbacks. Together they shared delusions about the Freemasons before leaving Europunga, and then later, when they got to Darwin, Sherry notes that Rod convinced her that she was a serial killer. So that gives you a great idea of their headspace at the time. So at this point, the story starts to get a little confusing, which is to be expected when you're relying upon evidence from someone that used to stay awake for 3 days at a time on drugs. So apparently when they saw the night hunters, they had one of Rod's sons, Sean, with them at the camp, but the other son, Callum, was not. They sent Sean into town to find him and heard from neither son after that. They were unable to reach Tamara, Sean's girlfriend, the school in Europunga, the store in Europunga, or the police in a neighbouring suburb. Each of these unremarkable events contributed to Sherry and Rod's growing belief that the Freemasons were closing in on them, and they decided that the Freemasons might have captured Callum and Sean, which prompted them to leave the bush and begin searching for them, and that's when all the shenanigans start. What happens next is pieced together from various witness statements with everybody that was involved in the next, say, roughly 24 hours. It's coming from the coroner's report, which is the only official version of what happened that day. When we get to the end, I have actually spoken to somebody else that was actually there that had a few things to add, but we'll wait to the end. We're going to go through all of the official documents, and then we're going to get to the end and we're going to have a chat about what we think really happened. Or, well, it's not really a two-way convo because it's a podcast, but I'm going to give you my thoughts, and you are more than welcome to give me yours. All my social media will be down below, and I would love to have a conversation because I actually feel like this has not been given enough attention. There's no documentaries. There was a Four Corners report that has been wiped from existence. I even emailed ABC and they just ignored me. I cannot get anything, and you would think for such a huge crime, and also who it was, Rod Ansell was quite famous, territory famous by this stage, there's just nothing being done, and it's crazy. I would love to hear thoughts and opinions, but for now we'll just get back into the story. So, according to Sherry's statement, they came in from the bush and they stopped at a mate's house in Humpty Doo. And they told them that they had lost Callum and Sean and said we'd send Sean up to Darwin to get Callum and bring him back. But the people who were chasing me, the Freemasons, we thought had kidnapped them. And we asked Goldie, who was the mate, if he would swap cars with us so they wouldn't recognise our vehicle. And that was Sherry's statement. And Goldie said no, so they went to another house of a friend called the Toyman and they had the same conversation and asked to swap cars, and Toyman also said no. So they drove into the city to an address in Milner, the house of Tamara's, who was Sean's girlfriend, Tamara's father, who Rod and Sherry suspected or apparently knew in their drug-addled brain was a Freemason. They seem to have kept the house under surveillance until dawn on Monday the 2nd of August, and then they knocked on the door and asked for Tamara. They were told she was not there. They kept the premises under surveillance for the rest of the day from concealment in some scrub alongside the property. They saw nothing of interest, so Sean's, Callum's and now Tamara's whereabouts too remained unknown to them. They moved on from Tamara's dad's house, and sometime in the late afternoon of that day, they drove to another friend's, the Stewart's house in Jingley. Nobody was home, so Sherry and Rod broke in. Sherry saw nothing wrong or unusual in this. Her and Rod were accustomed to being permitted the run of the house, and ordinarily the Stewarts left them a key. Once inside, Sherry helped herself to a drink of water out of the refrigerator. She said she felt odd after drinking it and concluded that the water was drugged. Rod also tried some milk. He too felt odd and thought the milk too had been drugged. Other details of the house further inflamed their suspicions. The dog was locked in the shed, photos were missing, the bed was unmade, and the kitchen was unusually untidy. They tried to use the phone unsuccessfully. All of these things they put down to the Freemasons. As to the break-in, Stewart corroborates that, and the telephone call. As to the drugged drinks, Robinson, another friend, corroborates that Rod spoke of the suspicious features of the Stewart's house to him later that night. All of this points to Sherry having somewhat of a reliable account of the shared delusions that her and Rod were having at this point. Rod and Sherry moved on, borrowing 2 medical kits from the Stewart's house, having it in mind that they might find Sean and Callum before the boys were killed, but after they were tortured by the Freemasons. The next point of call was the residence of Steve Robinson and Leanne Musgrave, which is on the eastern side of the Stewart Highway across the road from the T intersection with Kentish Road. They arrived there just on dark. On arrival, they were confused when they noticed a large grey van about 300 metres back from their property. Sherry said, "I've never seen anyone camp that close to Lee and Steve's place. It's a big bush block," and Rod and I looked at each other and Rod said, "What do you think? Do you think that's them?" I'm guessing he means the Freemasons. And I said, "Well, it feels bad. It doesn't seem right that they would be parked so close." And we sent in and sat with Lee and Steve for a little bit. And we drank some Coke and I got that same spinning effect from it. And I said to Rod, "The food's been doped." And he said, "Yeah, I think so too." Rod then took his rifle, a 30-30 lever action, which he had very unusually, it states, brought to town in case of need, and went out to assess the situation. When he came back, he spoke at length to Robinson. He asked him to come outside as he thought the house was bugged and away from Leanne Musgrave because I think he knew that Leanne might not fall for the bullshit that he was about to tell Robinson, which was that he had actually seen these Freemasons at the station and they'd approached him and said if he ever wants to see his kids again, that they wanted to swap the kids for his missus, who was the only one they wanted because of her information and tie-in. Now, regarding this, the coroner states in his report that this lie would seem to indicate that Rod appreciated in some sense that the chain of supposition and inference upon which he and Huitson had acted thus far was not likely to prove equally persuasive to a less engaged observer. In other words, most of Rod's male friends thought he was very intelligent and believed what he said and had no reason not to. However, Leanne Musgrave's statement kind of said otherwise. She wasn't really falling for this crap. That's why Rod was not going to talk shit in front of her. After this conversation, Rod, who had become absolutely paranoid about this grey van, begged Robinson to get out of the house with him and Leanne. And Robinson was shaken by Rod's words, but he wasn't stirred into action at this point. So Rod and Sherry left, and in Robinson's statement, about 40 minutes to an hour later, shots rang out. And there's every reason to believe that Rod fired these shots. According to Sherry's statement, she said, "We drove a couple of 100 metres up the road and pulled over. Rod was driving and he pulled over and said he felt we had to go back to protect Lee and Steve. And we argued about it for a while, and then he left and walked on foot back through the woods. About 10 minutes later, I heard 6 shots out of a rifle." Her account lines up with Robinson's account, who said he heard 5 shots in one series and then another shot. But then also later, more gunshots. At least one bullet hit their caravan, and it's Robinson's theory that Rod fired these shots in an attempt to get Robinson and Lee Musgrave out of the house, because he thought that the Freemasons were after them as well as him, Sherry, and his kids. The coroner's report says that after firing these shots, Rod found his way, for no known reason, across the western side of the Stuart Highway and further west again down Kentish Road. By the way, I'm going to put some photos of the crime scene and the roadblocks and everything on all my social media so that you can see what I'm talking about. Now, it says, if Sherry is to be believed, he probably passed close to her car en route. She heard some noises, but she never saw him again. She heard what happened next, and in her words, it says, "It sounded like I could hear feet running and I expected he would be coming back to the vehicle. And then it sounded like he had stopped and turned around and run back again, and I heard more shots fired. I heard David get shot, David Hobden, who we'll get to in a minute, and heard him crying out. And then I heard what I thought was Rod yelling for me to run, and at that point, I turned and left." Sherry drove her car south to Acacia and later hitched a ride to Queensland. And as the coroner says, so much for her. Considering she's the one that started all this bullshit, it's a bit rich that she fucked off as soon as it got real. But anyway, back to the story. Over on Kentish Road lived a man by the name of Brian William Williams. Williams and his wife were at home and in bed when they heard, according to Williams, 2 loud, apparently close gunshots, the first in a series of 5. Williams and his wife got up to see what was going on. Williams' neighbour, David John Hobden, also heard the gunshots and decided to drive down to Williams' place. Hobden jumped in his truck and drove over there. As he brought the truck to a halt on Kentish Road, he was shot at without a warning. The bullet smashed the windscreen of his truck and Hobden was wounded in the face, apparently by shards of glass, particularly in his right eye. Later on, doctors would confirm that he had lost 98% of his vision in his right side and it was permanent and irreversible. Even though he was injured, Hobden somehow got out of his truck and sort of half crawled towards Williams' house. Williams came out to assist Hobden towards cover. Hobden at this stage could not see at all and clearly believed he was wholly blind. The shooter came out of hiding and got into Hobden's truck, apparently trying to drive it off. Williams, when he saw the state that Hobden's face was in, was pissed. He picked up a baseball bat, charged towards the truck, and he said he smacked him down in the eyes with it in the truck. Smacked him down straight on the forehead with it, and that's when he blew my hand off. Rod had fired at Williams from the inside of the truck. A medical report later said that he lost his right index finger on the spot. The medical report also stated he had multiple pellet wounds on the left side of his abdomen, which means that the shooter must have used Hobden's double-barrel shotgun, which Hobden had brought with him when he drove down to investigate the trouble. Williams was sure he had been hit by a shotgun. Williams also says he then tried to open the truck's door, but his injured at what he thought was absent hand could not do it. Williams then retreated into the house. According to Hobden, as he was hobbling towards the house with Williams, Rod was yelling out shit about the Freemasons and child thieves and child killers and that he wanted his boy back or something. Williams would have these statements made by the shooter a little later in the sequence of events, after or during an exchange in which Williams was taunting the shooter. Williams told police he was yelling out, "You maggot," or "Come on, you maggot, you gutless maggot, show yourself." At which point, according to Williams, Rod was going on about stealing his children and being a baby killer and something to do with the Freemasons. And then, all of a sudden, he went into a repertoire of Hell's Angels. He was just mad. After a time, Rod began to fire at the house, through the walls, the back door, and the floor. Those inside, Hobden, Williams, his wife, and her daughter, who was only around 10 years old at the time, took cover as best as they could. No one was hit by any of these shots. The shooting came to an end, and Rod, having failed to get the truck moving because of some secret lock on the handbrake, moved away on foot, taking his rifle and Hobden's shotgun. The coroner had some thoughts on the whole situation. The coroner said that Williams and Hobden did tell the same story, but that Williams was wrong about whacking Rod in the head with a baseball bat, because when Rod's body was examined, he was actually no skull fractures or any marking to say he'd been hit in the head. So the coroner decided that Williams had probably hit the door of the ute and just didn't realise. The coroner went on to say he had no doubts about the rest of their story. Apparently, Hobden told police that they didn't ring the police about the shooting because there's always shootings out there every couple of years and the police never bother showing up. The coroner goes on to praise Williams and saying Williams, who went to Hobden's rescue without hesitation, got him to comparative safety, and then with berserk disregard for his own safety, tried to tackle the shooter. Even after being wounded himself, he was still boldly taunting the shooter, a dangerous armed madman. Despite Hobden saying no one called the police, the next part of the coroner's report goes on to say, Senior Sergeant Walsh, Watch Commander at Police Headquarters at Berrima, responded to calls from the Kentish Road shooting by attending the scene. So, I don't know what the fuck that's about. Anyway, they then had various units of the police force gather, and they assembled in the vicinity of the Stewart Highway / Livingston Road intersection north of Kentish Road, where a roadblock was established. Police halted all traffic on the Stewart Highway. After daybreak, police set up a detour via Old Bino Road and Hopewell Road and Cox Peninsula Road so that traffic could avoid their danger area by making a loop to the west. That probably means nothing to anyone that's never been in the area, but I'm just trying to set the scene. They also decided to block northbound traffic at Old Bino Road intersection rather than have Darwin-based police pass through the danger area. The police officers that came from Adelaide River were ordered to establish and man that particular roadblock. Those officers were Sergeant Glen Huitson and Senior Constable Jamie O'Brien. Despite already have been on shift for like 24 hours at that point, they arrived at the intersection at about 3:30 a.m. on the 3rd of August 1999, parked their police sedan diagonally across the road and began to stop and later divert traffic. At around 4:30 a.m, a Mr. Andrew Koshel caught sight of someone who might have been Rod. Koshel had been driving a truck northwards. He was stopped at Old Bino Road roadblock, parked his truck on the left, south of the intersection, and waited on events. After he had been there for around half an hour, he felt his truck rock, as if someone was standing on the back of the window. When he looked, no one was there, but he was able to see in a mirror a man dressed in dark clothing standing at the top of the fuel tank behind the cabin. This man moved from side to side. Koshel telephoned his wife, whispering to her what he had seen. She in turn telephoned the police. The TRG, which is the Tactical Response Group, went to the area. TRG members swarmed all over the truck, but the truck they swarmed over was not Koshel's. Koshel, seeing this, phoned police headquarters and told them that they had the wrong truck. As this was happening, he could see the man slide down from his position. The man was not seen again by Koshel. By the time the TRG members got to Koshel's truck, the intruder had disappeared. The coroner report says that Rod, known to be less than rational, was known to be in the area at the time and few other people were, at least, on foot. It is notable too that if the man was Rod, and who else realistically could it have been, then he was south of the roadblock, that is, outside the area being controlled by police and searched by them. There was nothing to stop him escaping southwards. So let that sink in. He could have escaped. He was a known bushman. He was phenomenal. He had like 50-something days where he was lost and he lived off fuck all, like cattle blood and beehive honey, where he tied a fucking thing to the leg of the bee and let it, like, what the hell? He could have escaped. He chose to stay in the area where they were looking for him. And that is the one thing that I don't think anyone can understand. Anyway, After this incident, the police searched, interviewed, and tried to make sense of what they were told by various witnesses. In lack of a previous connection between Rod and the Williams household, they were unable to do so. I will get to the lack of connection and why I think he might have gone to the Williams household a little later on, so stick a pin in that one. But for now, we're going to go back to the old Bino roadblock where O'Brien and Huitson were working their way down a line of vehicles, inspecting each one to make sure that Rod was not in them. A lot of the road train drivers did not want to take a detour, but after a few hours they got pissed off and just detoured anyway. So by about breakfast time, the officers were a little bit more relaxed. And by about 10:30 a.m, we're talking to two of the people in the roadblock, Mr. Jonathan Anthony's and Mr. Anthony Hobden, who happened to be David Hobden's brother, and they were running furniture around. They'd gone off to get breakfast and had come back to the roadblock and were, as I said, just chatting to Huitson and O'Brien when at 10:30, Rod decided to open fire again. The shots seemed to be coming from about 20 metres east of the Stewart Highway and about 20 metres north of the intersection. He had managed to find like one of those dirt mounds that's left when they do grader work, I'm guessing, and they have those like water pipes on the side of the highway. So somehow he'd hidden himself. He'd got there without anyone seeing him, which I guess it's Rod, so of course he did. And had positioned himself so he had a clear shot to where the police and the civilians were at that point. The next part of the story is going to be pretty much word for word O'Brien's statement because it's very important and I don't want to get any of this information wrong. So it goes as follows. I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy caliber firearm being discharged, although I could not tell at that moment from which direction the sound had come. The shot sounded to be at a close, although not point-blank range. As I heard this shot, the civilian who had been leaning against the fender was flung forward onto the ground and immediately began screaming. I heard Glen shout out to get on the ground. As these two events occurred, I immediately got out of my chair and swung around to look over at the boot part of the vehicle with my Glock drawn. At the same time, Glen crouched down next to the passenger door, got the radio and called communications and reported a civilian had been shot and requesting TRG assistance. This all happened in a matter of seconds. The civilian was still on the ground, lying slightly in front of the vehicle but in a fully exposed position. He was still screaming. I could not see where he had been hit and shouted at him asking this question. I did this to try and get some idea of the direction the shot had come from. The wounded civilian replied that he had been shot in the arse. I then scanned the area around behind the civilian's position. I then saw a person prone on the ground. I could see a beard and scruffy looking hair. I also saw he was wearing a green, fluffy looking jumper. The position of his arms and shoulders indicated that he was holding a weapon and I saw the front of a rifle barrel. This person, the gunman, was on the east side of the Stewart Highway and about 40 metres from our position. Between us and him was a narrow road verge, then a water pipe which runs along that side of the road and a recently created fire break. It seemed that when the fire break was made, the grader had thrown up a ridge of soil on the side furthest from the Stewart Highway. This ridge was about 40 centimetres high. As I took this in, the gunman crawled forward up to this ridge. The immediate area was lightly treed with short, unburned tufts of grass, providing a clear field of fire for the gunman. From his prone position, his line of fire just cleared the top of the water pipe and the ground between him and our position. I yelled to Glen that I had located the gunman's position and that I was going to return fire, which I did, firing 4 to 5 rapid shots in his direction. I did so because I could clearly see the gunman was in position to fire and was aiming in our direction. I saw my shots hitting the ground close to his position, which caused the gunman to pull his head down. I called out to Glen to grab the shotgun, which he did. He fired this through the open passenger side door of the vehicle, through the cab and through the closed driver's door window, which shattered. I continued firing my Glock with the intent of keeping the offender pinned down until the TRG arrived and to prevent him shooting again. I was particularly concerned about the wounded civilian who was still lying in an exposed position and visible to the gunman. I think that Glen fired 2 shots. I then heard another shot being fired by the gunman and saw Glen spin around, clutching his abdomen and falling to the ground beside the car. He fell on top of the shotgun and was moaning. I realised that he had been hit with a shot that came through the vehicle door. The wounded civilian then began screaming to his mate to drag him into cover. He said something to the effect, "He can see me, help me, drag me behind the car." As that occurred, I yelled to the uninjured civilian, "Go and get him, I'll cover you." I had dropped down to take cover behind the rear wheel. I then saw the civilian run over to his injured friend and began to drag and pull him towards the side of the car. I stood up and fired 4 more shots towards the gunman to keep his head down and to cover civilians until they returned to the relative safety of the car. I then saw the gunman lining his weapon up at me, and as I dropped down, he fired a shot. I moved over to Glen and rolled him off the shotgun and picked it up. I ejected the last spent cartridge and could hear, as it hit the ground, that it was unfired and made a mental note to pick it up later if I needed it. I then stood up and fired 3 shots in rapid succession in the direction of the gunman's position after returning to the boot area of our car. I ducked down again behind the rear wheel, which was the only cover I had. There was already an open box of shotgun cartridges on the back seat. I opened the rear passenger door and scooped a number of these towards me. I reloaded with 2 rounds. I had left my Glock on the ground near the rear wheel. As I stood up, the gunman fired another shot in my direction. Acting on the assumption that the information about the gunman being armed with a 30-30 lever-action rifle, I knew he would need between 1 to 1.5 seconds to reload, realign his sights, and refire. The gunman fired another shot, and I immediately replied with 3 more shots. At this point, I heard a vehicle approaching us from the south. I called out to the other civilian to try and stop it getting closer, and I also waved and shouted before I had to turn my attention back towards the gunman. As a result, I have no idea where the vehicle went, as it simply disappeared. I also began thinking about retreating to a drain that was about 15 metres away on the western side of the Stuart Highway. However, I realised that trying to do this would expose the 2 injured people, the other civilian and myself, to increased risk of being hit, as I could not shoot and help carry the injured at the same time. I therefore decided we had to stay in position until the TRG arrived, as there was no way I would have left the others behind in that exposed position. I estimated that I had only 1 round left in the shotgun and had to reload. As I reloaded, I fired 2 rounds from my Glock to keep the gunman down while I finished reloading. The gunman continued to return fire, but in a deliberate and controlled manner. Looking through the open rear passenger door and through the quarter window in the driver's side rear door, I was able to see the gunman was still in his position. I could see from the way he was lying and the positions of his arms that he was deliberately aiming towards us, although I couldn't actually see the weapon itself, which blended into the background. It was clear the gunman was waiting to get a clear shot of one of us. I decided that I would fire 3 rounds at a time and reload 2 to save time and to maintain maximum pressure on the gunman to hold him in his position. I realised unless the TRG arrived, I could run out of ammunition, in which case I would have to attempt to retreat with the others. I was concerned over the knowledge that the gunman could fire under our vehicle. Glen was lying next to the vehicle and the injured civilian, and I told the 2 civilians to take cover behind Glen, who had his ballistic vest on. The gunman continued the controlled rate of fire. While still crouched down, I checked to see the gunman's location and saw that he was maintaining his firing position and aimed towards me. I pointed the shotgun over the boot and fired 1 round. I immediately then stood up and fired 2 more before ducking down again. The gunman appeared well protected, and I did not hold out much hope of hitting him. I reached back into the back seat to get more ammunition. As I did this, I looked towards the gunman's position through the vehicle windows and thought that he was beginning to move forward. I called to the uninjured civilian to keep an eye on him while I finished reloading, which he did. I loaded 2 more rounds. The civilian said the gunman was crawling towards us, and I looked up, saw the gunman wriggling forward. I told the civilian to get down. I again fired 1 shot while crouched down, stood up and fired 2 more shots. As I did this, the gunman fired a shot in my direction. I heard a sound like a match being struck just past the right side of my head. I think that was the sound of a bullet just missing me. I reloaded with 2 more rounds, which by my calculation gave me 6 rounds loaded. I then heard the sound of vehicles approaching at speed from the north. I saw these were the TRG vehicles. As they pulled off north of the intersection, 1 vehicle clipped another, which rolled over. I was still watching the gunman through the quarter window. As the TRG debussed, the gunman fired another shot at me. I was down by the rear wheel reloading at the time. The TRG were calling out to me, "Where is he? We can't see him." I stood up and was pointing to the gunman, calling, "He's there." The TRG still hadn't seen him, and I realised that the gunman was concealed from their view by a high mound of dirt. I then saw the gunman rise off the ground into a kneeling position and aim his rifle in the direction of the TRG. The TRG had not picked up the gunman's position and were still grouped in a bunch. They were calling me to identify the gunman's position as they moved forward. I knew the gunman was about to open fire. He had turned his vision and attention away from me, and I had time to take a slower and better aim. I fired 2 rapid aimed shots at the gunman's head and upper torso area. I saw the dust come off his clothing and the gunman drop back down into the prone position. I was unable to tell whether he was injured or not, as he was still moving and seemed to be in his original position. I fired 1 more shot at the main body area and the gunman stopped moving. Rod was pronounced dead at 10:50 a.m. Glen Huitson was taken to the Royal Darwin Hospital and he was pronounced dead at 10:50 a.m. It wasn't even lunchtime and 2 men had passed away, leaving 4 children fatherless. Glen Huitson left behind 2 children, Joe, who was only 2 at the time, and his daughter Ruby, who was only 9 months old when he died. He also left behind his wife, Lisa, who he called his best friend. Glen had died a hero, but he already was a hero. He had joined the Northern Territory Police in January 1987. He'd served in both the Southern and Northern districts of the Northern Territory. During his service, Glen received a commendation from the Commissioner of Police in March 1994 when he attended a disturbance at a community near Alice Springs. He had disarmed a drunken person who was armed with a knife star picket and was threatening another person with a billy of boiling water. Then, in February of 1999, a few months before he was killed, a man called Wayne Constant hijacked a coach carrying tourists on Bachelor Road. He was armed with a loaded but not cocked sawn-off .22 rifle and was in the grip of a paranoid delusion, convinced that they, in inverted commas, were trying to kill him, not far off what happened with Rod. He was a long-time user of amphetamines, just like Rod was, and on this particular day was under the influence of amphetamines, alcohol and cannabis. Glen eventually talked Constant into putting down his gun and then he tackled him to the ground. He won a Valor Medal for this, or was awarded, they don't win them. After his death, where he bravely put his life on the line to protect others, he received the Australia Bravery Medal and a bar to his Valor Medal. He also had a monument built in his honour, which is located on Old Bino Road, Livingston, Northern Territory. On the front it says, "The Policeman from the Bush." Glen Huitson was a family man, a fine policeman too. He loved his jobs, his colleagues, and was just like me and you. Respected in all walks of life, no matter who he met. You could meet 1,000,000 people in your heart, but Glen you won't forget. He touched the hearts of all he met, and many he had not. The Territory came to a halt the day poor Glen was shot. His memory will never fade. He's always in our hearts. A Territory icon, he will always be a part. The people came from miles and miles and other countries too, all here to pay their last respects to the copper that they all knew. The NT Aborigines gave him a secret name. It is whispered now with great respect from sea to desert plains. There is a moral to this sad story to which you can relate. There are many more out there like Glen. Please respect them. They're your mates. In memory of Sergeant Glen Huitson, a bush copper, killed in the line of duty near this site on the 3rd of August 1999, protecting our community. Because Rodney was shot dead the day that he committed all of these crimes, there was never a trial. It was just a coroner's inquest. However, there were a few things that weren't mentioned in the inquest that I think are pretty important, and I'd like to talk about them before I finish this episode. As you might recall, Rod first went to Williams and Hobden's neighbourhood and ended up shooting up Williams's house, where there was a few people inside. Luckily, none of them got shot. However, it says in the coroner's report that the police were never called. According to one of the witnesses that was inside the house that night, I cannot say who. I'd love for them to come on this show one day. I hope they do, but until then, I need to keep their identity private. But they did say that the police were called, but the police did not come to the house. And as far as they were aware, they didn't come and there was no response. So I can't say that's 100%, but that's just what I've been told by someone that was there. The same person also told me that the house that was shot up was never actually made into a crime scene and no forensics were done. They came back to the crime scene after going to hospital and being checked over and whatnot. They had to leave the area while the cops were there. They came back within 24 hours and no forensics has been done and there was no crime scene established, and they were allowed to just go through their house and grab their belongings and touch things and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm not quite sure why that was never investigated properly, or whether that's just part of protocol, if that's just what happens if a house is shut up but nobody's hurt. Maybe they don't investigate any further, but I just found it weird that they wouldn't have even just done any sort of forensics on it. But anyway, that could just be the way that it works if no one's hurt. I don't know. I'm not in the law. And another thing that also stood out to me was if you type in Brian Williams, NT Supreme Court, you'll find that he was actually in jail or arrested for drug trafficking. He was a cannabis dealer, grower. He had lots of plants in his house, lots of weed. And the coroner said that him and Rod didn't know each other, and why would Rod go after him and why would Rod go up to his house or in that neighbourhood. Rod was a huge drug user. Rod was known to use amphetamines and weed and had done for a long, long time. And Darwin is not a huge big city, especially back then. And in that sort of scene, everybody knows everybody. So I find it really hard to believe that him and Brian didn't know each other. And I find it very strange that the coroner in this report didn't mention that and praised Brian for being a massive hero, which I guess he was in this instance. But the coroner didn't even go, oh, hang on a second, he's been in trouble with the law for dealing drugs and Rod was a massive drug user, because they go on and on and on about Rod's drug use in the coroner report, but they have not once mentioned that Brian was a drug dealer. And I don't give a shit if Brian Williams deals weed. I love smoking weed. Everybody does. Well, not everybody. You know what I mean. It's just, I don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with the fact that the coroner didn't go and put two and two together and speculates on how Rod would want to go after that particular house when he didn't know them, when it's pretty likely that they knew each other. So that is just really strange. That, no forensics being done, and the fact that they say the police weren't called, but the police, according to the witness, were called. Just, yeah, if everything this person is saying is true, that just leaves more questions than answers, really. Then, on top of that, if you try and find a documentary about this case, you won't. You just won't. I tried so hard because I love to do a deep dive. I want to know everything that happened. I want to, see as much as I can about the subject before I talk about it. I looked everywhere for a documentary on this particular case. There is nothing. There's not even... So there was a Four Corners documentary made about it, but if you try and find it, it's not there anymore. And I emailed ABC and they didn't even get back to me. And there's also... Rod did interviews after his went missing for 52 days or whatever it was, and he did interviews with Michael Parkinson, and I can't find those either. I searched through all of Michael Parkinson's interviews that I could find online. It just feels like everything's been scrubbed, and the coroner's report doesn't have information I feel like it should have. And yeah, I feel like there's just a lot that could be looked at with this case, and it wasn't. So make of that what you will. I'd love to actually do a documentary about this, but I don't think any of the people that were there that day will talk. I don't think any of those people in those houses will talk. I think that they were all a bit into the drug scene. To be honest, after reading Brian Williams's court documents, if he was made out to be an upstanding citizen in the coroner's report, then all of these other upstanding citizens probably were into the same shit Rod was into, just Rod was the one that lost the plot. And I really do think that's what happened with Rod. He just lost the plot. He seemed to have been a very smart and a very capable man that at one point did have his shit together. But I think with the demise of his marriage and the whole Crocodile Dundee taking his story and not even letting him have any credit at all when it was clearly his story, the whole bidet and the swag thing in the hotel, and, you know, Paul Hogan trying to say he got that just from a trip to New York. I don't think so. Like, it was all just too sort of around the same time. But the poor bloke never got any credit and Paul Hogan shafted him. So I understand that that would have been annoying, slightly, just an understatement there. And then also the shit that happened with his station and the cattle, and then he meets this other lunatic, and then they get on the gear together, and then they stay awake for days at a time, and she starts filling his head full of this Freemason crap. And then his sons, obviously, I don't know what happened with them, but not being able to find them, even though it sounded like a bit of a miscommunication, but because they've been awake for so long on drugs, they just jumped to these idiotic conclusions. And it's just a waste of someone that could have done something good with his life. And he did sort of at the start of it, but unfortunately he did not die the hero that he was in the start of his story. And that's a shame, but I think it's more of a shame for Glen Huitson and his family, who were completely innocent and just trying to protect the innocent citizens of Darwin and got caught in the crossfire. So that's what I think happened. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this, especially the end bit with my little conspiracies, or they're not so much conspiracies, just massive holes in the story that's told by the coroner's report. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I will link all of my social media below, and feel free to let me know what you think. I will be back next week with another episode, and until then, look after yourself, and I will talk to you soon.